The year is 1587. Somewhere in the cobblestone streets of Paris, a man walks nervously, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize him. Tomorrow he will stand trial. Not for murder, not for treason, not even for stealing bread. His crime? He couldn't perform in bed. Yes, you heard that right. In late 16th century France, a man could actually be hauled into court because his marriage had failed to be, shall we say, properly consummated. Judges, witnesses, doctors, even priests could all be summoned to examine the situation. And it wasn't just whispers in dark taverns. It was an official, legal proceeding, carried out with all the seriousness of a high-stakes trial. Imagine the humiliation. A crowded chamber, neighbors who once smiled politely now leaning forward to hear every sordid detail, learned men in robes debating the very question of whether a husband was capable of fulfilling his duties. It sounds absurd to us today, almost like the setup for a cruel comedy. But for people of that era, it was deadly serious, because marriage wasn't just about love or companionship. It was about alliances, family honor, and even property rights. So tonight, I want to take you inside that world, into the dimly lit courtrooms where reputations were shredded, where the most private acts of human life were dragged into the public square. Welcome, my dear listener, to one of the strangest and most humiliating chapters of European history, the courtroom of the bed. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, marriage was not a matter of the heart. Forget about candlelit dinners, whispered poetry, or dreamy notions of true love. No. Marriage was paperwork with a side of obligation. It was a contract, a transaction, a carefully calculated business deal designed to merge families, wealth, and bloodlines. Love, if it ever arrived, was a happy accident, not the foundation. And because it was treated as a contract, it had to be sealed like one. But unlike signing a deed or exchanging coins, this seal happened in the bedroom. Or, more accurately, it was supposed to. Because if the couple failed to consummate their union, society viewed it as more than just a private embarrassment. It was a threat, a breach of contract that put entire family legacies in jeopardy. Let's pull back and look at why this mattered so much. Picture the sprawling estates of noble families, where tapestries hung heavy on the walls, and dynasties measured their worth not in words, but in heirs. Kings demanded sons who could carry the crown. Noble families demanded proof that their alliances weren't wasted. Even ordinary townsfolk, far removed from courtly politics, believed that a marriage without children was cursed. To be barren was to be broken. To fail in the marriage bed was to invite shame, whispers, and suspicion. And whispers never stayed whispers for long. In those days, gossip was the bloodstream of society. A neighbor noticing that the new bride wasn't glowing with pregnancy by the expected time. A servant overhearing muffled arguments behind bedroom doors. A family friend quietly counting the months since the wedding feast. Soon, the murmurs spread. Something was wrong. Something wasn't working. And in a culture where everyone's honor was tied to fertility, it didn't take long before those murmurs transformed into accusations. Accusations of impotence. Accusations of failure. And once those words were spoken aloud, they were nearly impossible to shove back into the shadows. Families dragged each other into courts not because they loved drama, though admittedly many did, but because inheritance, property, and honor were at stake. Now, imagine being the man at the center of this storm. One moment, you're a respected husband trying to navigate the pressures of married life. The next, you're being told that your very masculinity, your ability to fulfill what society considered your most basic duty, is under legal examination. It's not just your wife or your in-laws judging you. It's your neighbors, your priest, your entire community, and soon, perhaps, a panel of judges. Let's be clear about something. These trials weren't simply about two people failing to conceive a child. They were about public accountability. If a man could not prove his virility, the marriage contract could be annulled, meaning dowries could be returned, alliances broken, and family reputations shredded. For noble families, this could unravel carefully constructed political deals. For commoners, it meant disgrace and financial ruin. Either way, impotence wasn't just a personal misfortune, it was a social catastrophe. And society loved to watch a catastrophe. Picture a town square in rural France. Farmers selling their produce, women gossiping as they draw water from the communal well, and somewhere in the background, whispers rising. Did you hear? The Lefebvre boy cannot perform. His wife has gone to her family. They say it will go to court. The scandal traveled faster than wildfire. It wasn't long before private marital struggles became the public's favorite theater. The church, of course, had its own interest in all this. For centuries, it had declared that marriage was a holy union, sanctified by God, sealed by the act of consummation. To skip that final step was not just an insult to the family, but an affront to heaven itself. Priests reminded their congregations that marriage existed to produce children, to continue the faithful, to ensure society didn't crumble under the weight of sin. A barren marriage, in their eyes, was one step away from a curse. And so, when couples failed, it was not merely a disappointment. It was a failure of divine order, which meant naturally that the church felt justified in poking its nose into bedrooms, sometimes literally. There are documented cases of priests being called to verify the situation, to question the husband and wife, even to inspect the bed linens. Privacy, as we think of it, simply did not exist. Meanwhile, kings and noblemen had far more pragmatic concerns. For them, heirs weren't optional, they were survival. A dynasty without sons was a dynasty on the verge of collapse. Alliances were made and broken based on fertility. The Tudors, the Bourbons, the Habsburgs, these names weren't just family trees, they were power structures, and power needed continuity. A barren marriage threatened everything. Even among ordinary people, the pressure was relentless. Peasants might not have owned castles or titles, but they did have fields, livestock, and land that needed to pass to the next generation. Children weren't just symbols of fertility. They were economic assets. They worked the farms, carried on the family craft, and cared for their parents in old age. To fail at producing them wasn't just embarrassing, it was a practical disaster. And so, failure in the marriage bed became everyone's business. Not just the couples, not just the families, everyone's. The whispers grew into stories. The stories hardened into accusations. And once accusations took root, there was often only one destination left: the courtroom. Ah, The courtroom. If you're picturing a solemn chamber with high ceilings and stained glass windows, erase that image. These trials were sometimes held in makeshift halls, crowded, noisy, and fueled by curiosity. Imagine townsfolk cramming into the space, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the disgraced husband. Imagine lawyers, judges, even medical experts debating the intimate details of someone's private life, as though they were discussing trade tariffs. Imagine, most of all, the crushing humiliation of being treated as a spectacle, your dignity picked apart in front of an eager audience. It was theater. Cruel, invasive theater. And yet, society treated it with utmost seriousness, because beneath the mockery and the whispers lay the heavy weight of consequence. A man declared impotent could lose his marriage, his property, and his honor. A woman trapped in such a marriage could face scorn, or be forced to remarry elsewhere, her reputation scarred. And the families, their alliances could crumble overnight. This is why those whispers, once spoken, carried such gravity. They were not idle gossip. They were the first rumblings of a storm that could shake entire households. The storm that transformed private failure into public judgment. The storm that gave birth to one of history's most bizarre and humiliating spectacles. The courtroom of the bed. So, how did these trials actually work? Let's step inside, shall we? Imagine a cold hall, the smell of damp stone lingering in the air, a crowd already pressing at the doorway. This wasn't just another legal proceeding. It was theater. Human dignity laid bare for the entertainment of the masses. The couple, awkward and trembling, were summoned before a panel of judges. But let's be very clear here. These weren't the kind of judges you might expect, robed in wisdom and solemnity. Oh no. The panel often included physicians, sure, but also midwives, neighbors, and sometimes priests. Imagine Father Jin, who can barely keep his hands off the communion wine, suddenly presiding over your sex life. People who had absolutely no business judging intimacy. And yet, here they were, holding your entire future in their hands. The wife, usually the accuser, was the one who lit the fire. She could claim her husband was impotent, unable to fulfill the sacred, unspoken contract of marriage. Her words carried weight. After all, society loved to believe women were natural witnesses of their husband's virility, or lack thereof. And so, she would recount, sometimes in excruciating detail, how he had failed her in bed. You can almost hear the gasps, the whispers, the stifled laughter from the onlookers. The husband, red-faced and humiliated, of course, could deny it. "I am perfectly capable," he might insist. But denial wasn't enough. In fact, it was nothing. The court demanded proof, and proof in this context was horrifying. This is where the spectacle took its darkest turn. Medical experts might be called to examine the husband, right there in front of witnesses. They would poke, prod, and handle him like livestock, trying to determine whether the equipment was in working order. Sometimes, midwives would even be asked to test arousal. Imagine the sheer humiliation. Being stripped, touched, and judged by strangers while a clerk scribbles notes for the court record. And it didn't stop there. If the husband passed the physical examination, there was the dreaded trial by Congress. Yes, you heard that right. In some cases, the couple was ordered to perform intercourse under supervised conditions to prove once and for all whether the marriage could be consummated. A handful of judges, physicians, and curious townsfolk might literally sit outside the chamber, waiting to hear sounds. Or worse, they might demand to see the sheets afterward as evidence. Privacy in this courtroom was a foreign concept. Your most intimate failures became public record, your humiliation written down in the annals of law. Imagine standing in that hall, knowing your reputation, your future, your very manhood was hanging by the thread of whether strangers believed you could rise to the occasion. For many husbands, this wasn't just about pride, it was survival. A guilty verdict of impotence meant the marriage could be annulled. That meant returning the dowry, losing property, and facing lifelong stigma. To be declared impotent was almost as bad as being declared a heretic. It was a scarlet letter no man could ever wash off. And the wife? Her position was just as precarious. If she lied, or if the court decided her husband was perfectly capable, she could be branded as deceitful, even adulterous. Some women were accused of faking impotence, claims to escape unhappy marriages, or to chase wealthier matches. For them, the courtroom could turn quickly from salvation to prison. The irony, of course, is that the system was rigged for shame. No matter who won or lost, both husband and wife were dragged through an ordeal designed to strip them of dignity. Even when the court sided with the wife and annulled the marriage, her reputation was scarred. Society whispered, was she barren, frigid, cursed? And when the court sided with the husband, he had to live with the stain of having been accused in the first place. Nobody truly walked away unscathed. And yet, these trials happened again and again. Why? Because they weren't just legal proceedings. They were moral theater. They reinforced the expectations of society. They reminded men, your virility is your worth. They reminded women, your duty is obedience, but you may cry foul if the contract is broken. And for everyone else, it was a spectacle, a delicious, scandalous story to pass around the tavern that night. Imagine it. After the trial, the townsfolk would gather in the marketplace, reenacting the humiliating testimonies, laughing at the poor husband's expense, gossiping about the wife's accusations. In a world without Netflix, this was their binge-worthy drama. And unlike fiction, this drama destroyed real lives. So the trial begins, not with justice, but with shame. Not with truth, but with performance. A man and woman reduced to actors, forced to play their most private struggles on a very public stage. The couple was ordered to prove consummation. Yes, right there, in front of witnesses. Imagine being told, perform your most private act, not in love, not in passion, but under the cold eyes of strangers scribbling notes. The humiliation didn't end there. If he failed, he was often physically examined. Doctors would prod, poke, and declare their verdict like mechanics checking a broken cartwheel. Sometimes they even forced the man to undergo a trial by arousal. Yes, they would test whether his body could respond on command. If the man failed, the wife could walk free. The marriage was annulled, meaning it was erased as if it never happened. She could remarry, reclaim her dowry, and sometimes shame her husband's family forever. For the man, it was devastating. Not just the divorce, not just the public humiliation, but the permanent stain on his name. No woman wanted to marry a man once declared impotent by law. The courtroom of the bed reminds us of just how intrusive society once was. Something that today is deeply private was once dragged into the cold light of public judgment. It also reveals a darker truth. Marriage, in those centuries, was less about love and more about property, heirs, and control. And if you failed to serve that machine, you became its victim. If you enjoyed this strange and haunting story from the past, subscribe to Midnight History. More tales of forgotten rituals, bizarre trials, and dark human experiences are waiting for you, each one stranger than the last.